Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is the series where we take privacy-enhancing technologies out of the abstract and show you how they're actually being used in the real world. Welcome to Pets in Practice. Many of you have probably heard the term pets a lot lately, but it still isn't really obvious what they do or how they fit in day-to-day business. The truth is, pets are already all around us. And without knowing it, you are probably using them every day when you browse online, use your phone, or if you're a cable TV customer, maybe you're benefiting from some of the work of Dr. Daniel Smullen, the principal privacy research engineer at CableLabs. Organizations like CableLabs are showing just how approachable these technologies are, letting businesses analyze data without moving it, collaborate with partners they never thought they could, and run fully secure customized AI models. In this series, we're breaking it down. We'll look at what's pushing pets into mainstream adoption, the rise of secure AI, the pressure to get more value from data under strict regulations, and an ecosystem that's matured enough to make pets straightforward to roll out. And we'll hear from the people who are using them in production, what worked, what didn't, and what's now possible because of them. So if you're looking for better, faster, safer ways to collaborate and innovate with sensitive data, you're exactly in the right place. Today, we're diving into the cable industry, shared R&D problems, and privacy-enhancing technology standards. Cable companies are deeply ingrained in our everyday lives, from TV to the internet to communications. We've also all encountered those long privacy policies that we accept without reading. This creates challenges for providers and for consumers like us. Daniel is here today to talk about how organizations can think about using pets to make privacy experiences frictionless. And I'm very much hoping you're going to tell us we don't actually need to read those privacy policies. So we'll see about that. But let's dive in. So Daniel, privacy is not the first thing that I think of when I think about cable TV. So please, could you tell us about CableLabs? What's the goal of the organization and what makes privacy and security so critical to what you do?
Yeah, for sure. I love working at CableLabs. CableLabs is a nonprofit R&D company that actually serves the cable industry. Basically, it's the global broadband industry leading member-funded R&D and innovation lab. And what we do at CableLabs is we focus on co-creating things like next generation technologies and aligning what's a really dynamic ecosystem to advance connectivity worldwide. So what we do at CableLabs in particular is we focus on enabling scalable, globally adoptable capabilities, and that these capabilities support a really wide range of deployment choices rather than prescribing particular business models or operational approaches. In fact, that's something that we explicitly don't do. So by exploring new ideas and co-creating these innovations and new technologies, we help do things like remove or mitigate risks from emerging solutions. We provide our members with flexible technology options, and that helps them drive things like differentiation and innovation and efficiency across their network infrastructure. So it's important to point out, as you said, like cable companies, they're internet service providers. CableLabs hasn't done much work in the video space for quite some time, although we do work on technologies for streaming and things like that as well. But in the privacy and security technologies group, which is where I belong, I'm the principal privacy research engineer. We're working on essentially securing digital infrastructure, really, in the broad sense. Broadband networks themselves are critical digital infrastructure. That requires that there are capabilities such as the secure handling of identity, right? Signaling, control, data traffic. Privacy and security are core architectural requirements of today's networks. They're not add-on features, right? And so they really need to be designed into protocols, platforms, systems. So in terms of my research efforts, when we define privacy and security capabilities specifically, we're talking about things like reducing attack surfaces, we're reducing operational risks, we're ensuring that there's consistent primitives that can improve interoperability across ecosystems. We're talking about scalable and deployable solutions that are well aligned with things like regulations and regulatory and operational realities. These things have to actually work. And then all of these efforts together, they help advance the overarching CableLabs mission, which is really enabling practical, adoptable network capabilities, giving our members flexible technical options. So that way they can take these technologies, they can use them to innovate, they can use them to differentiate themselves and best serve their customers.
Thanks. That's really interesting. And I noticed in how you're describing what you're doing, it seems like you're coming at it more from a security bent, maybe than a privacy bent. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. So I see security and privacy as inextricably linked to one another. But the thing that really differentiates privacy from security is that you typically can't solve privacy problems with security technologies. You can't encrypt your way out of most privacy problems, even though it might actually, from the surface level, seem that way. A lot of the time, folks maybe over-index on the common principle of confidentiality that exists between privacy and security. But privacy and privacy enhancing technologies is much, much more than that. It includes elements that are related to simply communicating information and ensuring that people actually understand what it is that they're getting into. This element of transparency. That's not necessarily something that's thought about from the security side. In fact, my background, I originate from Carnegie Mellon's Scilab. And in there, where we study usable privacy and security together, we think about ways to configure systems. And this analogy is really effective for kind of distinguishing security from privacy. When you talk about security, there's usually one way that you configure something to be secure. You set it up that way, you employ the security best practices, and you got it, right? When it comes to privacy, there's almost never a one size fits all solution that meets everyone's needs. And the reason for this is because, unlike security, privacy is a highly individualistic, very subjective, almost feelings oriented. So it involves a lot of elements of cognition and cognitive psychology and human factors that security really doesn't. Now, I mentioned transparency earlier. That means ensuring that systems, the technologies that underpin them, and the choices that are available to people that interact with these systems are clear. People know what it is that they're actually getting into when they choose A versus B. They know what the settings do. They have confidence that the settings actually have the outcome that they expect. And what this essentially drills down to is control over data flows of what's known about me out there in the world, what I'm communicating to the world about myself, about my family, to those around me, and so on, right? So that's really, I think, the core difference between privacy and security, even though, again, it's really important to emphasize that privacy can't exist without security and security technologies, right? You don't have the ability to enact control over how you're representing yourself in the world or what others know about you if you don't have those fundamental elements of things like confidentiality, where you, in fact, do have the ability to stop people from knowing things that you may not want them to know and things like that. Keeping your communications secret and private are an excellent area where security and privacy overlap. But as I said, privacy is much, much more nuanced, much more complicated.
Interesting. Yeah, and much more personal and emotional, as you
Absolutely.
said.
Yep.
In what you mentioned, you started to touch on a little bit about privacy technologies versus security technologies and settings and configuration. So, without getting too technical, how are you using privacy enhancing technologies, and what does that translate to in terms of value to your set of customers, being the cable companies, but also to their customers, which are, you and me?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in a nutshell, I personally take a much more expansive view of privacy enhancing technologies than I think many other practitioners might.
Right?
So, I really insist actually that we move beyond this notion of things like encryption or anonymization being the sort of be all end all. And in fact, I could go on a philosophical tangent about why anonymizing everything really is not a practical approach, because we exist in a world where we, in fact,
Completely.
need to communicate about ourselves to others, right? But what I really mean is that pets can include things like mechanisms for ensuring that rights and obligations follow data. So a lot of folks will refer to that as things like data usage governance. And sometimes that's not thought of as a privacy enhancing technology, but I argue it absolutely is, because it's, again, something that ultimately empowers people. Another
And this is
element.
about using technologies to enforce or choose levels of privacies rather than using privacy technologies to do computations or things like that. Just a distinction that you're
Yeah,
making in how you think through it.
That's right. That's also a matter of perspective, too. Different organizations, whether they're cable broadband companies or whether they're big tech or whatever, they'll often take a sort of dichotomous view on privacy enhancing technologies. One, which again, I think is much more in the sort of encryption and anonymization camp, which is one where this is something that we provide, that is to say, privacy enhancing technologies are a thing that we provide as a service to people, right? And so we're going to make things private for them, which in my view, again, it's not invalid, but it's just a simply different philosophy from the alternative, right? And both of these can coexist, to be clear, but the alternative, which is rather than providing this service to people, we're going to do privacy for them. Privacy is more like a conversation or a negotiation where we are attempting to best fulfill what the user is essentially seeking in terms of privacy, right? We're addressing their concerns in a way that we empower them to address their own concerns as opposed to addressing their concerns for them. Right? Does that make sense? Both of those approaches also have common pets underpinnings, right? One example of this is, for example, tooling for automation, driving consistency in the approach throughout an entire ecosystem or architecture, right? But then again, the camp that I'm talking about, where we go outside the sort of like anonymization centric view on privacy, means things like, more usable consent and choice mechanisms, right? So like interfaces that
Okay.
enable consumers, customers, whoever, to express their preferences in ways that devices and services can understand, right?
So what does that mean? Because when I thinking about it, let's say as a layperson, I get a new piece of tech or a new software or what have you. I get a 100-page privacy policy and tech policy. I hit
Yeah.
agree and I'm off to the races. So you're taking that concept and making it, let's say, less friction for everyone by using technology. Is that
That's
kind of a
one way to
fair
look
way
at it.
to?
That's
Okay.
one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is to entirely break out of the norms that we've thought about, where unboxing new technology and that out of box experience might work in ways that don't really resemble that mode that you just talked about, where people are presented with this huge privacy policy document that, of course, research from CMU Scilab years and years ago, actually more than a decade ago now, have shown that people, it's not just that they don't read the privacy policies, it's that they can't. This is really an intractable, it's a fact that no person, if they were to read the numerous pages of privacy policy disclosures that they encounter from all of the products and services that they engage with on a daily basis, you wouldn't have enough hours in the day to do it, even if you had the legal training to truly comprehend what was in them, right? What we're exploring at CableLabs in particular is, and this is especially relevant for Internet of Things, right? These devices that you might unbox and bring into your home and that people have concerns about and that they want to be able to trust, right? So we're exploring IoT architectures that support essentially the declaration, discovery, and signaling of privacy preferences across network devices and services. So again, we're breaking out of this mold of you're the user, you have to be entirely responsible for your own privacy, subject to the limitations of your ability to understand these inscrutable privacy policies that you're bombarded with. What if instead you are able to simply declare your own privacy preferences somehow, and then systems and services and devices could adapt accordingly? Or at the very least, you are able to signal these preferences and these needs and these privacy concerns to these devices and services and systems.
To like simplify it is instead of me getting a privacy policy from the service provider, I'm giving them my preferred privacy policy.
That's a simplistic way to look at it, but I think that's a good way, a good
So
mental model, right?
direction of
Yeah,
travel. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. So really what the work is focusing on really is defining like interoperable mechanisms and primitives that allow for this new type of infrastructure and this new mode of interaction to exist. And it's very important that I portray it this way because the alternative, which we're not going for, is prescribing device behaviors or prescribing business policies, right? We don't want to do this. That's not the goal of the technology that we develop. It's actually more to enable broader ecosystem adoption and to unlock new paradigms. And as I said, the way that we do this is to define these new mechanisms and primitives that truly don't exist, right? We're stuck right now, and many companies are stuck right now in thinking about things from this very sort of prescriptive mode of operation, right? Here's our terms and services, take it or leave it. And I think that it benefits everyone to think about alternative ways that folks can interact with systems that actually empowers them more meaningfully, that gives them the ability to say, hey, listen, I'd rather you did this and not that. And the reason why unlocking this type of user-centric way of thinking through technology is so beneficial, not just for end users and customers, but for companies, is actually because a lot of the research in the literature that I've studied now for, as I said, for decades, it shows that people are actually far more willing to give you their trust and signal that trust by allowing you access to their data and giving you the privilege of their business and being more loyal to you and so on. All of these things that businesses desire, right? When you make them feel as though they're empowered and you empower them with meaningful choices that clearly are actionable and that make a difference in the way that they interact with systems, right? As opposed to this sort of take it or leave it. Here's our menu, and if you don't like it, go somewhere else.
This is so riveting. I mean, it's as much a privacy and security problem as it is a psychology one, as it is a
Yes.
design one. Is your team mostly engineers, or do you have people from these types of different backgrounds also helping out with this?
So the reality of privacy engineering, and actually this is a really good time to mention that last year we published a paper on defining privacy engineering as a profession. The reality of that profession of privacy engineering, and again, something that makes it very distinct from security, even though security absolutely has human factors, security mechanisms don't work when people don't use them. The
Mhm.
usability angle is really important. But one of the things that really distinguishes privacy engineering is that it is an interdisciplinary endeavor and that involves drawing in people from very different disciplines beyond engineering. That includes legal, tech policy, and potentially things like user experience designers and other experts that don't necessarily focus solely on how to develop software which is scalable, reliable, etc., but also on human factors and understanding how people, again, perceive things, understand things, whether people have confidence that when they press this button, it's going to do the thing that they expect, and how to communicate what's going to happen and what to expect to people effectively. All of these disciplines are actually, not just in my opinion, essential, but in the research that's in that paper defining privacy engineering as a profession, which again, we published that in the Proceedings of Privacy Enhancing Technologies. I think it's quite relevant. But folks out there doing this work in the wild are doing that kind of integration, that cross-disciplinary collaboration. And that is actually applying across not just big tech, but companies large and small, and even government agencies and institutions. That is the nature of privacy. And that's what, in my opinion, makes privacy so interesting and unique.
I totally agree. At the same time, because it's so interdisciplinary, it's often hard to communicate what it is and how it works.
Yep.
How do let's say, do your stakeholders in the cable industry know that you're using pets in this way or that you intend to? And how do you communicate that to them? And I already noted when you introduced yourself, it seemed to me like you're taking much more of a security bent to it. Is that sort of how CableLabs presents what it's doing to your constituents, or how do you think through that?
We're touching on a number of different things here. So let me start with the first one. So we offer technologies and options. We don't implement these things directly. That's a really important
Hmm.
distinction because the mission of CableLabs is not to go out there and to build this stuff for any particular company or anything
Of
like that.
course.
It's to develop things like technologies and standards and make those available to our members so that they can choose what works for them and they can choose what works best for their business. And I think that's something that's very important about privacy enhancing technologies in general. As I said, there's no one size fits all solutions here, right? They
Mhm.
just, as much as it would be nice if we lived in a world that were so simple, we just don't, right? Now, so going back to the second piece, right, which is I think more the security angle, things like that.
It's even before that, it's because
Sure.
you're offering options,
Yeah.
it makes the communication challenge even more challenging, I think, in a
Yeah. How
sense,
do we
right? Because
demonstrate value? How do we make people understand what we do is,
I think
or
it's
so,
that, but also how do
yeah.
you help your constituents understand the options soup to nuts so that they can decide whether it's something they want to implement and how. They need to really
Yeah.
understand it deeply, much more deeply than I would say like a typical organization that's using pets. might
No,
be
you're
the case.
absolutely right about that because you can put the technology out there into the world, but then the usage of that technology is up to the users.
Exactly.
Yeah. So one of the best mechanisms, in fact, for ensuring that things end up getting done right after the initial sort of innovation work happens is also innovating in standards and standards development. And CableLabs work like is shared directly through its members through things like specifications, working groups, like collaborative R&D discussions. I work almost a consultant, but not really. It's more of
Okay.
a bi-directional kind of communication than that, right? But the relationship between standards and technology is really important. And so what specifications do is they enable not just the basics for technology adoption, making it possible for different members to pick it up. Like these specifications, they enable interoperability across vendors, across devices, across systems. But what they do more so than that is they allow these privacy enhancing technologies to actually be implemented consistently, even in heterogeneous environments, right? That understanding element, though, is also quite foundational. So standards do things like establish common terminology and semantics for things like privacy guarantees, right? That can include things like how do we ensure that data use is constrained in a certain way, right? Or how do we ensure that there are limits on the disclosure of data or data sets or elements within the data set? How do we ensure that we are aligned on expectations for things like enforcement, right? And so what this does is this allows the pets to actually operate predictably across different implementations by different people. So when you do things like defining shared interfaces or signaling mechanisms or even things like behavioral expectations, right? Not just from users, that is one element of the research, but also for the systems, of course.
Sure.
Those standards allow the pets to actually scale beyond things like isolated deployments, which is actually quite often where we see in the research how they're deployed today, and expanding and scaling beyond that, and then integrating into broader network and application architectures. Right. That's really important. And then from an even more technical perspective, what standards do is they also create things like architectural clarity, right? It helps the technologies align with things like existing products and protocol stacks and control planes and life cycle processes, right? Rather than, which again is the common mode that we see today, requiring like bespoke development effort to integrate these privacy enhancing technologies. Because again, as I think we talked about earlier, really can't just bolt on privacy and security technologies, right? It's something that if we lived in an ideal world, if everything were really simple, it would be wonderful if we could, but that's not the reality. The reality is that we need to think about privacy, like security, as an essential element of the design of systems. But we don't
Mhm.
get to just demolish and rebuild everything from scratch every single time that we have a problem that we want to solve, right? So again, the standards and that relationship with the technologies that we develop are really how we get that uniformity and that predictability so that the engineers within various organizations and companies and business units within businesses and so on can use the privacy enhancing technologies correctly and consistently and get out of it what they purport to offer, which sometimes is actually the most challenging aspect of pets in general. Like encryption, I think people, even laypersons, right? I hate the term laypersons, just so we're clear, because everybody understands privacy. I don't want to go on a total tangent here, but I love to tell people that as much as I ramble on about architecture and all these fancy concepts, right? Privacy is something that everybody inherently understands, which is why we don't walk in on each other when we're in the bathroom, right? This is a very basic thing that everybody
Yes.
kind of intuits. So the technology aspect of it is essentially just an analogy for the tools that we already use to protect our privacy in the physical world, right? We know how a lock works. We know how a
Mhm.
privacy screen works. All of these things are analogous to the ways in which we enable data privacy and consistent architectures and choice architectures and all of these super fancy, highfalutin technical concepts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know not to open the bathroom door when someone's in there. So you've simplified it even
Yeah.
to something I get. So no, that's
Well,
that
and
that
you
that,
know that
that
it's a bathroom, right? Imagine if we
Yep.
lived in a world where you didn't even put up a sign saying it was a bathroom. You'd end up with a lot more awkward situations where you're inadvertently violating people's privacy, right? It's such a simple thing. Everybody knows, yeah, you got to put up a sign letting people know it's a bathroom, right? But then when you get into the world of technology and complicated systems where it's not even necessarily as tangible as a sign that you can see and reach out and touch, right? You've got to be much more deliberate about the design and making these predictions for where these awkward moments might occur and do things to mitigate them, right? Addressing people's privacy concerns, in other words.
This might have been the simplest and best analogy for people's understanding of privacy I've ever heard, truly.
You can thank Lori Craner for that one.
Noted. Yeah, all credit to her. So actually, I think that the bathroom sign analogy and what you've been talking about is a very good one. Is a segue to where is your world going, right? So you're working on these privacy standards, you're doing this innovation, this R&D.
Yep.
In the next 12 to 24 months, where do you see this evolving? Do you see this actually being, let's say, implemented by one of your constituents in their IoT offerings for CableLabs specifically, and then even outside looking left and right to what others are doing? Sort of where do you see everything going in the next 2 years or so?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question because it's one that you really ideally should always ask whenever you're developing any kind of new technology or whether you're trying to standardize any kind of technology. One thing I will say is that there will be new and emergent privacy enhancing technologies that right now I haven't even thought about, and that I'll encounter somebody else out there in industry or academia developing. And those emerging pets, again, I couldn't say precisely what they are, but they're going to inspire new standards development work, right? We're going to prove what's feasible. And so as R&D uncovers better ways for us to express or enforce privacy preferences, right? That standards development organizations, which we're working with now, so good examples of this are like the Internet Engineering Task Force and the W3C within them, right? Those types of organizations provide us with a platform to codify these new techniques, right? And not only give us a forum for discussing them and ratifying the standards, but also getting out there that they exist. And that I think will also lead to adoption. And this cycle of interacting with standards development organizations who are participated in by people all across academia and industry, doesn't matter what sector of industry, by the way, this cycle ensures that the standards can actually remain aligned with real world needs and they don't ossify, right? That's the path forward. But where the destination is, I think in the short term, my personal vision is a shift more so towards user-held privacy preferences. It goes without saying, we've already talked about this sort of flipping the modality, offering new modes of interaction when it comes to things like privacy policy, right? But standards that enable people to carry their choices with them across devices and services, right? I think that is where we're going. And in the short term, in fact. Another one that you might find interesting is pets that are deeply embedded in infrastructure. So from like home networking to IoT onboarding, which is the work that I described with privacy policies. By the way, that is work that's actively ongoing at the IETF. We do have internet drafts that are out there reversing the pattern of the device dictates privacy, right? It should be the users really, but those signaling mechanisms are what we see as the short-term evolution, right? We need underlying infrastructure that enables these preferences to be communicated more effectively to these systems before we can live in a much further afield future where these devices can then be more respectful of our privacy desires and goals and be more respectful of our privacy concerns. And to be honest, that comes a lot from where pets are already being used today. In fact, like fraud and abuse prevention systems, right? They're using pets, and this is again across industries and pet-like mechanisms to minimize data exposure, right? That's a really important area. And in fact, one again where privacy and security intersect. And then another is things like consent layers and preference signaling frameworks. Again, we've talked about that a lot. Of course, it's something that I talk about a lot because that's my active area of work, right? But they're starting to integrate more and more into the everyday user experience, right? So they're coming outside of the theories, things like nutrition labels and things like that, and they're making their way into systems that people are actually interacting with, even when end users and sometimes even when folks in industry don't recognize them as privacy enhancing technologies. So I think that for me in particular is where things are getting really exciting. But we're humans and we only have so much time and attention to spend on configuring preferences. And quite frankly, none of us buys devices so that we can spend all day like configuring our preferences on them, right? We want to actually use them.
Daniel, we're coming towards the end of our time, and
Sure.
usually I ask people what advice they would give to organizations looking for innovation and growth, and I feel like that's been our entire discussion. So I'm going to ask you something quite different.
Sure.
What is the Queen of England doing on the wall behind you?
I am a Canadian. And I immigrated to the United States about 12 years ago now. And Canadians have a really interesting relationship with the UK and the royal family. And growing up, I had my grandmother tell me stories about how she had tea on a submarine with like British sailors that were harbored in Toronto Harbor. I grew up just outside Toronto. And I always grew up with kind of a sort of admiration for this very traditional view of British and Canadian society and what have you. And so to take that with me and express myself, I reached out to Canada Flag and Heritage Services and found out that they actually give out free portraits of royalty, like the Queen, as well as, it's a 100-year-long wait list, but you can also get the flags that fly above the Canadian Parliament building.
Wow.
Maybe my grandchildren's grandchildren will be able to get one of those if I sign up today. So I'm not going to hold my breath on that one. But I did get the poster, and it's something that I've actually kept with me in my workspace just to remind me where I come from and of my family and family traditions and the unity of Canada and Canada's place in the world. And I am very proud of where I come from. And on the opposite side, in front of me, behind my camera, I also have the Canadian Bill of Rights and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to remind me about that relationship that my work has with the law. We talked about privacy engineering being that interdisciplinary aspect, but also of doing the right thing, doing right by people, and ultimately empowering people to preserve their rights, to fulfill our societal obligations that we have to one another. Because I think that type of thinking is really essential whenever you're addressing a really important topic like privacy and security. So that's why I have the Queen up on my wall to remind me of all of those things.
I'm very glad I asked this question, and I don't think I can come up with a better conclusion for this discussion than what you just said. So, Daniel, thank you so much for your time. I
Well,
really
thank you.
appreciate it. I'm sure that this will be an episode that the audience is really going to love, and we'll get a lot of questions and good feedback on. So, you've given me a new and fresh perspective, not only on how to define privacy technologies, but to simplify how to explain them. Definitely taking the bathroom analogy from here. And thanks again. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Much obliged.